Protocol for today. Again, thank you very much for joining us on a beautiful June day. And on behalf of all of us here at the Utah League of Cities and Towns, we just want to say, first off, thank you for all you guys have been doing in these unsettling, ever-changing times by keeping your jobs in your cities and your towns. And if we have any county members with us as well, welcome. And thank you for keeping things running. And, we're all, as we can see, need each other to get through this. And hopefully we'll continue to do that and hopefully get you the resources you need here at the League to do your jobs in the city and town arena. Okay, so Spencer, I think if you haven't already, we can record this, which is just another note that we will be posting this on the League website after a recording. If it's going to be such a great show you want to share with all your friends and family, I hope that's the case. I doubt it, but please feel free to see the recording later or share it with your colleagues or others that couldn't join us. All right, so today, Land Use 101, we're going to talk about general plans and zoning. And this is part 2 of our 4-part series here in June, our Throwback Thursdays, back to the basic powers and duties of what we're statutorily enabled to do. Our first session was last Thursday, and again, that's posted up on the League website. And that dealt with talking about your overarching powers and duties for council members and land use authorities and appeal authorities. And that is again posted. And today we're going to do part 2, which is general plans and zoning. What is your statutory authority and what are they? What do they mean and how do you use them? And then next Thursday, we're going to be doing a panel in conjunction with Utah APA called Kickstarting the Economy Through Rethinking Public Spaces. We've all been pivoting with the COVID pandemic to figure out how do we make public spaces viable in today's world. So that's going to be a panel discussion with some best practices and examples of what some of our cities and towns have done. And then finally, we're going to finish up on June 25th with all the rules that you need to know. I'm sure you all know them, but just a reminder or refresher. And again, as you all know, planners love acronyms. And so we're going to try to decipher through some more acronyms today, but we will talk on the 25th about OPMA, the Open and Public Meetings Act, GRAMA, the Government Records and Management Act, and the Ethics Act. That will be a Reader's Digest version of the rules that you have to know in order to do your job. So that's today. We'll get started. Spencer, any questions or problems on your end running this so far, or are we ready to get going?
I think we're ready.
All right. So we're going to start off by just asking who we have with us on the call today. It looks like we have 65 plus people. And so I just want to get a feel of what our audience is since I unfortunately can't see you. So who's with us today? If you want to just take a second and answer the poll, and then Spencer will show up those results. We'll give you a second here just to answer if you can. While I take my water break. All right, Spencer, you think that's some results to share, or?
Yeah, let me go ahead and share those.
Thank you. All right. Well, excellent. Hopefully you can all see that. We've got a lot of planning commission members, a few council members and mayors, staff. Oh, we have the attorneys, and I'll have to admit right now I am a land use planner, so the attorneys, you'll be heavy on the chat box. And then we've got some clerks, excellent, and then the fallback, I do it all. We have a lot of those, we know that. Probably these days a lot more, but thank you all. The next question we'll ask Spencer is just how long you've been in your job so I can get a feel of what kind of experience level we have with us today. And again, we'll just take a second here to let you guys answer that, and we'll have Spencer share that with us. Whenever you're ready, Spencer, we'll pop that up. Excellent. Okay, so we run the gamut here. We have some new folks. Welcome to your first year. Quite a year it's been so far since January. We've had quite a few events happen. So thank you for serving, and hopefully next year will be a little different. And then we have 1 to 3. Then we've got some veterans here, and those folks that are been doing this longer than they can count. Well, again, all right, that's great, Spencer. We'll move back. We appreciate you all being here. That's super helpful. Looks like we have a variation of experience levels, but we'll let those senior folks and all those attorneys weigh in on the chat box, and they can correct me and give me better stories. Okay, general plan and zoning. Let's get to it. What is a general plan? Well, it's a living, breathing document, and I like to call it a practical vision for the future. It can come in various shapes and sizes. There is no mandate. It has to be 1 page, 3 pages, 700 pages, and we'll talk about those specifics mandated from the state law. But really, I like to think of it as a checklist. Where do you want the community to go? What's the vision? I find it to be one of the hardest things to create, because you're trying to generate a collective communal vision for that community. So think about your planning commissioners, your council members, how many different opinions you have just within that small group. And that's the real genius of this, is that you have to create a collective vision from all those disparate voices. So a general plan, a practical vision for the future. Today, we're going to talk about why we need it, what it entails, what it was required, and then how you may use it. So we're going to start off with a citation here. And again, this is the document that I'm sure you all have and use and have by your bedside table and refer in your bookmarks on your phone all the time to the Land Use Development and Management Act. That is Title 10 of the Utah Municipal Code, Chapter 9A, and that is where all of our source of authority comes from. And again, at our session last Thursday, we went through the details of those powers and duties. So if you'd like to, you can always look at that recording. Today, we're going to talk about the specifics in Part 4 of this title, and it's Title 17 for any of our county brothers and sisters out there. So the titles are very much the same, a little bit different for the counties, probably about 5 or 6%, but fundamentally we both have the same requirements. So the general plan, it is required. That is why. That's the first reason why we have it. And it is required in order to accomplish the purposes of the Land Use and Development Management Act. And it's intended, again, that practical vision, to talk about a plan for the present and future needs of your community. How are we going to grow? What are we going to be? Do we want to be big, small? Do we not know? What is it? What's the future of how we're going to connect land use, transportation, roads, water, sewer, infrastructure? What's it going to be? This is the plan for your community. And I've also added on this slide the state website, le.utah.gov, and that is where you can find the LUDMA chapter. And it's really a great website, pretty user-friendly. So beyond your own code, if you ever have questions, what's the state code parameters, then you can just go to that website. So this is why we have it. We're required to. And why is it important? What beyond just a mandate from the state? Well, again, we talked about that practical vision, but I like to call it the soft and fuzzy. It's that harder area to quantify, those goals, those visions. How how are we going to change? How are we going to move forward? It should help you establish priorities for not only your zoning, the next level down, which I'll talk about in a second, but how you build out your future community, or you maintain what you currently have, your infrastructure and your investments. So it helps place decisions in a long range context. In 5 years, we think this. In 10 years, we think this. In 3 years, we want to achieve this. And it's really all to make that place in your community special and unique. Why we all take the time to serve our communities and invest in our communities. This is that general plan put into action. Any questions so far, Spencer, or are we doing okay?
Nothing so far. We're doing all right.
Excellent. All right, so why is it important? Why do we need this plan? Well, because a lot of real estate investment choices rely on that, property rights. It's a guide for how you make those decisions, where you invest your infrastructure, how you develop your zoning codes and ordinances. If you're deciding that you want to be a very urban area, then your zoning should complement that vision, right? And then that is what developers, applicants, property owners, homeowners rely on to build that vision. Zoning changes on property, often the general plan will help you understand whether those make sense within your plan for the community. So it's an overarching vision, but it has importance and significance when we actually get to the building stage. Does the general plan have to meet the zoning? And let's talk about zoning. So we have a plan and then we have zoning. What is zoning? Well, zoning implements the plan. It's where the rubber meets the road, I like to say. It's the actual hard tax statistics. You get to build here and this size, this height, these setbacks. It's the specifics of that vision. So does it have to match the zoning? Does our plan to become the biggest urban metropolis in the nation with 100-foot high rises and neon signs, does it have to match the zoning? Well, under state law, it does not. There is no concurrency law, rule in the state of Utah, but obviously it just makes sense and it's good practice, right? If we want to be that urban mega metropolis, then we would not have zoning that allows one house per 100 acres, right? The two don't jibe. So we're not mandated to, and in other parts of the nation, other states have concurrency rules. You may have heard of that. You can elect to do that at the local level, but I think there are some certainly pros and cons of doing that. If you haven't updated either your general plan or zoning code, which I know you are all doing, it'll make the impetus to do such much more urgent if you have a concurrency statute in your own code. So at the state level, not required, but obviously makes good practical sense. What does the general plan have to have? What does the state say it's required to do? Well, you have to have this practical vision for land use. What goes where are the parks, where are the houses, where's commercial, where's industrial, what do we think? It's that soft and fuzzy. We think this area might generally be good. It's a very nebulous map. It's not as specific as your zoning, which has exact parcel details. This is more the Crayola crayon. Do we think this area in red is good for land use? We think area is good where transportation connections will come. And then for certain cities of a size, you have to have a housing element. And we'll talk about that in more detail in 1 second. So what does this plan look like? I said at the beginning, it could be 1 page, 5 pages, 6 pages. Well, it's up to you. And here's the actual language from the state saying you can determine the comprehensiveness, the extent, and the format of the plan. So we have to have land use, we have to have transportation. Certain cities, 82 of us, have to have housing element. But you can add other elements if you like to your plan. So maybe in my community, I live in a very hilly area and we want to talk about slopes, or we want to have a plan for sensitive lands. Maybe we have a river or wetlands. Maybe historic preservation is really important to our community. So we add an element about what the community may want in that area. Maybe, recreation could be another. Maybe you live in a town that has incredible trails and access to national or state parks. Then you might want to have a recreation element. Those are completely up to you. The legislative body who makes the actual decisions, the Planning Commission recommends, and then you construct those different elements of your plan. So again, we talked about this. It's a long range decision. It's used as a compass for the community. Again, we talked about these categories just a moment ago, but we are required to have housing, land use, and transportation. You can dictate the other categories. The transportation element, one of the mandatory elements, it talks about where are your roads? Where are your collectors? Do you have mass transit? Do you have bus service? What do you have donkey service? What is it in your community that you use for people to move from here and there? And how does that relate with how you're going to grow or not grow and your land use? And this just happened 2 years ago when we had an update to the general plan to enhance that moderate income housing, or that housing element. And they said, hey, they codified what we're actually already doing, right? All you planning commissioners out there, it just makes good sense, right? We always want to look at, when we look at a site plan, we look at the traffic, transportation, circulation. And this is just the state is really saying, hey, we know you do this, but we're going to mandate it. So it's really good practice in planning. So I don't think it was a huge surprise to add this, but it is a requirement under our general plan. There is no timeline. It is just saying when you create this plan, please look at these elements. It should be part of your plan. How does it all work together? Particularly on the Wasatch Front, with the growth projections that we still have, and maybe with this pandemic could be even shifting or accelerating. We don't know yet what the outcome of that will be, but we do know that we are growing, have felt those pressures, and they're just asking us to make sure that we look at all of that and how are we planning for the future. Because ultimately, you guys at the local level make that decision and will dictate how we as a state and a region grow by those local decisions that you make. Okay, I mentioned this housing element. Moderate income housing is the actual name. And last year, on December 1st, 82 of you were required to submit a moderate income housing plan. And you had a menu of options in your general plan to pick from, and say, we're going to examine and look at these things to plan for moderate income housing in our area. And just for a definition, moderate income housing is 80% of the area median income or below. So that's going to be different for all of your communities, but that's what that means, moderate income. And so all of you submitted them. Thank you very much. If we have some folks on the call that went through that, we appreciate those efforts. We had 100% compliance with the state. And now for every year hereafter, on December 1st, you are going to have to submit a reporting form on how you're doing with your progress of implementing the plan. Very simple form. We got it down to, I think, 8 questions. It's going to be issued through the Department of Workforce Services, but here at the League, we will have the form on our website and easily accessible for all of you. We tried to make it really simple. It's really, how are you doing? What the efforts that you made, and most importantly, what are the barriers? We'd very much like to be able to report back to the state what are some of the barriers in trying to implement some of these plans. So that's the moderate income housing plan. Spencer, I'm just going to take another pause and see how we're doing.
So far, so good.
Excellent. All right, either you have good sandwiches or you know this stuff, or I don't know. Hopefully you're following with me. So we've talked about the general plan. It's required at the state level. You have to have a few elements in your plan. It can be any shape or size that you choose. 1 page, 7 pages, and I'll give you an example of, if I were queen, what I think a general plan would look like at the end of this. Now, what does it do? Like, so it's a vision and it's going to set our zoning, but it's also very important for your capital improvements program. So planning commissioners, you may not have much participation in the actual capital improvements plan or infrastructure planning, whatever you call it in your community, that the council ultimately does, and your public works department. But the two really go hand in hand. And council members on the line, this is really, you'll look to the general plan to see where you're going to do that physical investment. Where should we put money into sidewalks? Where should we put money into street improvements? Where should we put money into infrastructure? How are we going to make this plan happen? So really, the capital improvement plan helps implement that vision, that plan. And again, I mentioned sometimes planning department, you may not be in constant contact with public works, but you really should be on that plan because the two kind of need to go together.
Meg, do you mind
All
if I
right.
jump in here?
Yes.
So just
Yeah.
a couple things. We have a comment from Neil Cohen just saying that the county general plans also require resource management plan for the public lands as defined within the county. And then a question from Brian. He says, what was the threshold that triggered the 82 that needed the housing study and plan?
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you so much for the county input. Yes, like I mentioned, there is additional requirements under the county statutes. So thanks for pointing that out. There's also ag preservation zones that you have to sort of deal with. And I think that's part of that resource management plan. And that was due quite a while ago. So if I understand correctly, so hopefully y'all have those and are implementing those up. That was a big push a few years ago. And so the next question from Brian, thanks Brian, was about the threshold for the 82 cities. It was population based. And so it was a certain threshold on size. All towns were exempt from that statute. So the thing to look for is as you grow as a community, you may be kicked into that population threshold. And on the league website, and I believe it's under legislative resources tab, we have a housing data center where we not only have the enabling legislation, which was SB 34, Senate Bill 34. So we have that exact language in those population thresholds. Plus, I believe we have a list of the 82. Plus, we have some resources on housing that we created about basically just housing policy considerations and some best practices, as well as a manual on accessory dwelling units. Those are all on our league website, and hopefully that can help you. Any questions, you can just get a hold of myself at the end of this, and I can help you navigate that as well. Great. Okay, now we're going to take a second here for a pop quiz. Spencer, I'm going to let you do the honors. We'll see how well you've been following me today. And we'll give a sec here to take a pause, let you fill that out, and we'll see how I'm doing. This is, I guess, a test for me. Okay, Spencer, what's the survey say?
We've got a few more coming in and I'll share it.
Okay. Hopefully it's not a lot of hums. Oh, look at that. Well done. Okay. So for those that maybe just were still confused, it does not have to legally match the zoning. Again, there is no concurrency law that the plan has to meet the zoning. It just obviously makes super good sense. Thank you, Spencer, for that. All right. So we've talked about our general plans, and then where the rubber meets the road is the zoning. How does the plan relate to zoning, and what are the statutory requirements for zoning in the state of Utah? Well, you'll be surprised to know, and if you attended my session last week, you'll know the answer to this, but we are required to have a general plan, right? We're required to have a planning commission. But we are not required under the state law to have zoning. It is not statutorily required. If you choose to do it, you are allowed to create, and this I'm by saying they, you, the legislative body, always, the city council, the policy making board, is allowed to create as many zoning districts, shapes, forms, sizes that they see fit under their development code. So the code puts into place this vision. And again, they aren't mandated to have to be exactly concurrent, but obviously you should do your best to make sure they are. And this is the statute site, Title 10, Chapter 9A. Again, it's Title 17 for those in the counties, 505, and it talks about the creation of zoning districts. So again, you have incredible latitude to decide what areas make sense in your community and to amend those. There's a process for amending those. We call them, you might be familiar as a rezone, completely at the discretion of the legislative body. And one of the things that you'll use, so you first decided a zone, and if someone comes in and wants to amend it, or if the council wants to amend it, you'll look back to that general plan. Does it make sense? Is this what we had envisioned? And so the two really go hand in glove. So what is zoning? It's actually the specifics of how each parcel of land can be developed in your community. And I like to think of the zoning code as a welcome. Welcome to our town. Here's how you can build. Here are the regulations that we have decided. Here are the regulations that we have written down and codified. Here's how you do it. It's not a manual that says, here, welcome to our community. Here's how to say no. It's here's how to develop and create the vision of our plan in our community. All right, it implements those plans. And again, you can have the zoning. That doesn't dictate that they have to develop. If they come in to develop, they have to use your rules. But, you know, like under different areas, you can see a house that's maybe older or falling down, and it's not, you know, under your current codes, it's not what you envisioned or your plan. So they can let that happen for as long as, again, we won't talk about demolition, but they can stay there until they come in to pull a permit for development. Then they're subject to your rules. So you can't initiate folks to do projects unless you have some kind of public partnership. But again, once they come in for an application, they need to meet the regulations that you have in your code. So how important is it to have a code that designates exactly what we intended? And that's why we've been pushing here at the League for many, many years to keep updating your zoning code, because state law has changed as far as some of the things that are allowed and how you can review and different processes for noticing. Again, that's in the first section of this session that we had last week that's taped. And so you can go back and look at that for reference. But it's very important to make sure that your code is clear, written in plain language. That is actually a statutory requirement. Plain, clear, objective language. Hi, welcome to our community. Here's how you can build. So let's take an example, excuse me, of how maybe the goal of a general plan relates to the action at the zoning level. So we have a goal that we will develop zoning that will be compatible with the land use map and land use definitions. And then the action is to modify those zones so that they can, again, comply or correspond to the general plan. So in other words, an example here is we had a light industrial zone that used to look like the picture on the bottom. And then we created a new zone with different standards for the future, because zoning is for the future and it's not static. And then over time, we were able to create a different type of looking project in that zone. But again, zoning takes time. This isn't overnight. And again, you can't compel this person to come in and apply and go through this. It's their own private property right to determine when they come in for that application. But you can set the vision and the goals that's enforced through the zoning. Economic development, another example. So you had a goal in your general plan to continue to grow property and sales tax at a rate higher than population growth. That was a goal in your plan. So the action would be maintaining the zoning in the areas that are currently zoned for office and industrial, so you can allow for that commercial development to happen and you can get that sales tax. So in other words, if someone came in, so here's your general plan map, here are your zones. Someone came in and said, hey, we really want to rezone this commercial and office space to residential. Well, you could look back to your goal and say, hey, we really have a goal of trying to maintain these zones so that we can have some different forms of revenue and taxation to help us grow as a city. So no, we're not going to rezone that to residential because it doesn't make sense. You certainly could take the opposite and say, now in this new future, we think that it should be residential, but then you should probably amend your general plan and talk about that through on the policy level. So again, they're flexible, intertwined documents. They set that vision. The zoning is what the development community relies on, but there is a process in order to change that zoning if you need to. How do you process all of this stuff? Well, for both, I think, the zoning and the general plan, you want to obviously look at the problems and areas in your community, how you're going to grow, what it looks like, put those goals together, get some data, have some public input. And then the Planning Commission for both the general plan and for zoning is the statutory body that's required to have a public hearing on both the creation of a general plan and the creation of a zoning code. That is the state mandate. It's only one public hearing. We obviously recommend more, maybe not so much, depending on the zone, maybe not so much, but for the general plan, absolutely 100%, because as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a collective vision for your community. So I think public outreach is very important. I think you use all the tools in your quiver. Online communication, maybe socially distanced, surveying in public. I don't know how that will work now. Putting out mailers through your city or town. If you have like a newsletter or a mailer, or if you have a water bill, if you run your own water service or something like that, trying to get as much input as possible for what is that collective vision. Ultimately, the legislative body, the city council, will take that recommendation from the Planning Commission, and then they, because they get paid all the big money, will decide. We like the plan, we don't like the plan. We want to modify the plan or send it back to the Planning Commission to think some more. Ultimately, it's their decision to adopt, reject, or modify, as well as with any creation of a new zone or rezone. Ultimately, it's the city council's authority to take that final action. These are just some examples of outreach that we had used. This was one on the web with Layton. So pretty good you know, they got 1,800 individuals. They ran this general plan visioning input from October to January of quite a few months. There are different ways to do it. I don't think there's any magic bullet. I think this is one great tool for you to try to get some input and have survey results. I think when we figure out the in-person meetings again, that still is helpful, but more and more with the shift to online, as long as we can try to be inclusive. And I know some areas have opened up their libraries for online access for those folks that don't have that ability to have internet service. This is just an option up there for you to think about. This was also just another example. Mill Creek, I really liked how they went about the creation of their general plan, lots of public input on that, but they had this concept of big ideas. And I like that because that's really what a general plan is. It's those big ideas, and then the zoning is the hard task that implements them. So they call this the Big Ideas Event Series, and this was their outreach summary, but they would have a different big idea and then try to gather input on it. And I think that really set the tone for the community to think, yeah, we're thinking big of where we may go. And this was Gathering Places, another example of when I talked earlier about soft and fuzzy and Crayola lines. This is kind of this is that beginning stages of planning in the general plan. What do we think? Where could it go? The visioning, the fun part of planning. Okay, so this is an example of a very small community in Utah, and this is Big Water, and I like to show this not for content, but for the outline and format. And I mentioned that if I were queen, I'd give you some examples of what I think might go in a general plan. And again, it's really your discretion, but I think this one I've always liked because they just said, here's why we're doing the general plan, here's how we did it, here's our land use, here's our transportation. We also decided we wanted to have resources and public services because that's important in our community. We're going to talk about what's on the ground now, existing conditions, what we think. Here are our assumptions for the next maybe 1 to 3 or 3 to 5 years, maybe 5 to 10. The actual statute calls for a 5-year planning horizon, but you can amend or add or tinker with that. And then they said, okay, here's what's on the ground, here's what we think, and here's some policies that we're going to pursue in order to achieve this plan. So I like it because it's straightforward. You'll notice in here, there's not much about the history of the community or other things. Those can certainly be appendices, but that's not the focus. It's important because maybe it sets the vision, but it's really where we're at, and it's a checklist. And again, their resulting policies, pretty simple. The council is going to aggressively pursue this item, and they set a date. And again, these aren't binding, but it's a good work plan, a checklist for your community. And so I like that. It gives you some goals to achieve. And my community where I live, every year they get together and they just go back to this document and say, how are we doing? Did we meet some? Do we need to adjust some? Are we never going to meet these? Should we delete some? Because as you all know, with the last 6 months, things are constantly changing. So this is a document that helps guide you through the future of your community. This was another implementation page. I think this was from Draper. And again, they decided they have sort of like Big Water, but here's their strategy. Here's their category of implementing it. And then they talk about how they're going to do it. Spencer, any questions? I'll take a pause here for a moment.
No, nothing new.
Okay. All right. So I mentioned if I were king, queen, if I was in charge, if I someone asked me how I would create these things again, the Big Water framework is a good starting point. But I would have in here the plan and how it's used, what it means to your community. How do we use this? How do we use this as planning commissioners? How do we use this as council members? Be direct, be plain. Often people don't even know they have a general plan. I know that's not the case for all of you on the call today, but what is it? How does it relate? Put it right there, right up front. And secondly, your values. What is it that vision brought forth? Who are we? Where do we want to head? And then the framework. So we have to have the land use, we have to have the housing, we have to have the transportation. But, you know, maybe you talk about economic vitality, maybe you talk about open space, maybe you talk about your public and cultural resources. Just suggestions, again, beyond the 3 that are mandated. Again, the housing only for 82 communities right now. That doesn't mean you can't have a housing element, and we certainly encourage that. It's just that it's not a state mandate. And then after the framework and after how we use it, I would talk about implementation, very much like the Big Water. How are we going to do this? This isn't a document that we struggled through just to have it sit on the shelf. It actually means something. And then should you choose to, the appendix. So all those, any of that data, you don't have to have it in there, but if you want it, put it in there. How do we base our decisions on some of these goals? Was there data? Were there surveys? What did we do to engage the public? Put that as an appendix, but it's not the heart of your document. And again, this is my recommendation. There is no mandate. This is just what I think makes practical sense after having looked at over 150 or close to 200 of the general plans throughout the state. They come in all shapes and sizes, and that's great. But really, I think it's important to show why and articulate somehow why this is important. Well, we kind of whipped through this one quickly, so that means you have time to answer a few questions or ask any other questions. I think Spencer has allowed it so that you can unmute, but you certainly welcome to ask me any questions at this point. Again, this will be recorded. This was our general plan and zoning segment. We have the powers and duties as section 1, and then again on the 18th and the 25th, 2 more of these sessions for the month of June. Little disconcerting just to talk to no one, but I am listening. So if you would like to ask any questions.
Maybe we have one that came in just now that said, how are general plans adopted?
Excellent. Thank you. So the actual statutory process is, again, I mentioned the Planning Commission as the advisory body has to hold a public hearing on the general plan. So any adoption, modification is held at the Planning Commission level. You guys are the people who have to do that. It's only one under state law. I would look at your own code to see what process you have added on top of that, if any. And then you send that up as the advisory body to the city council, the legislative body. So again, it could be the town council or the county council, depending where you're at. The legislative body ultimately takes the authority to adopt, modify, or reject the general plan.
And then Meg, we have another one. What is the greatest barrier to communicating the general plan to the people in our districts?
Yeah, I think, and it depends. Larger communities, smaller communities may be easier. Larger communities, it's very hard to articulate that it is that practical vision for the future and why it matters. And, often we create these plans and then we get everyone showing up at the zoning or the administrative level after we've created the plan or set the policy. And so I think it's a very much a struggle to try to get representation from all different segments of our community before we make that decision as the Planning Commission and as the council. Different communities do different things. I mentioned the quiver of tools. So some communities if you can accommodate it, do, in my community, they do coffee chats when they're updating the plan. They did neighborhood parties trying to get input. Smaller communities that I've seen have done, and again, this was pre-COVID, but they would set up a table outside of the one grocery store, or if there are two grocery stores, on a Saturday morning with a note card in a box. And it's just really, I think, old school outreach. And I think that's why it's important before you start that outreach plan to really make sure that the planning commissioners and councils and staff who will be presenting that are to try to say why it's important. It's important because this is going to set the path for how we grow. It's important to get your input before we make these laws. So I wish I had a magic bullet or answer for you, but that's why I said I think it's the hardest document for us to create, but it's very important. And it's kind of the lifeblood of how your community will grow in the future.
Meg, I have 4 other questions.
Excellent.
If you don't mind going
Thank
through
you.
those. Let's see. One from Aaron Wells asking regarding zoning, how does vesting work for applicants when the council or planning commission is in the process of updating code?
Excellent. Great question. Vesting, what does that mean? Okay, there's actually under Utah State Code, and I believe I actually am going to pull up the section when we talk, but vesting is very important, and that is the onus is on, and let me actually see if I can, I'm going to do this here for you. 1 second. I'm going to pull up our session from last week because we went over exactly that question, and it is very important. So bear with me. And then Spencer, are you able to see?
Yeah.
This? Okay. Excellent. Okay, hopefully you can all see this to answer the vesting question. So this is Title 10, Chapter 9A, Part 5, Section 509. Here's how vesting works in our state and how the impetus is on the staff, Planning Commission, if you guys accept applications, if you're not fortunate enough to have staff, and what does that mean? So when I submit a complete application to your department, in other words, you have to have a form, you probably have fees that you've adopted the city council by a fee resolution. I walk into my town hall, I submit an application, then I need to hear back from the town or the city or the county, is it complete? And so you have to have a process at your staff, or again, in some smaller communities, planning commissioner or the clerk, or clerks may be doing this. What do you consider it to be complete, and how do you notify that to the applicant? Well, typically it's an application form and it's that fee. So it may not be, it's not a decision, it's not all the information that you might need as you get through the review. It's a trigger that says this is a complete application, and that entitles the applicant, once it's complete, that's what vests him. It also allows him to then go through the land use review process that you have set up in your community. So it doesn't guarantee him approval or anything else. It just says you are complete, you can move forward through the process. But that is the trigger, a complete application. So it's very important that you have some kind of a way to distinguish that. And why is that important? Well, that vesting really relates to the fact that once it's deemed complete, so let's say today or Monday I submitted an application, and my town is so efficient that they got back to me yesterday and they said on June 10th, we deemed your application complete. You are now able to go through the process for whatever it may be the permit is on. That means that the code that's in place with my town at that time, that's what I'm vested in. I'm vested in that code and that process. So it's important because sometimes we alter the code, we change the code, we're amending the code. It's also important because I've seen in other communities, applicants will go up to a planning commission and informally just say, hey, what do you think about this? And then they think they're vested. So it's very important that you have a process that talks about that trigger.
And another question from Betsy Montoya: how big of a part should City Council play in the creation of or the process of creating a general plan update?
Excellent. Good question. And again, no statutory mandate on that. So it's up to your discretion. But I have seen the most successful ones working together fairly closely. And what I mean by that is, again, just use an example of where I live. The council got a request up from the planning commission saying, hey, we really need to update our general plan. Is this something we can focus on? And the council said, yes, let's have a joint meeting and let's set the parameters for what that looks like. Are you going to do all elements, some elements? No, are you adding new elements? What is it exactly that you guys want to achieve? And they had held a joint meeting. They kind of worked through, it was a work meeting, and they went through the details. And they came out of that with a work plan. And then every 6 months, they held another joint meeting to check in with the planning commission. Because again, the council's part of that team doing the outreach and garnering that information. They're going to want to let the planning commission do a lot of the grunt work, perhaps, and create those documents. But it makes no sense to have the council and the planning commission have completely different goals, and then have the planning commission invest time on one tangent while the council is on another. So I recommend you work closely together, work hand in glove, but let them come to you with a final product, but make sure that you guys are all walking through it together, so that there's not a lot of waste of energy or effort or ill feelings.
And then Elise Harris asks, is it unusual to incorporate either by reference or directly the future street plan?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time? You broke up on me.
Is it unusual to incorporate either by reference or directly the future street plan?
In the zoning code, I believe you mean incorporating. You could certainly reference it. Absolutely, streets master plan. In the general plan, you'd want to identify that, or say we have this capital facilities plan or road plan. So, but you don't. So you could reference it, but you don't need to codify it.
And then we have another question about amendments to zoning, but when you're making an amendment to zoning, do you have a public hearing and planning commission, the council meeting, or both?
Yes. So under state code, and again, you need to reference your own code, but the state code mandates for any rezone or changing to zone, and the same as creating a zone, that the planning commission has to hold that one public hearing. And then it goes up to the legislative body, the city council. It does not have to be a public hearing under state code. It can be a public meeting. So it is the flexibility that the state is giving you at the local level. So you may mandate in your own code that the council has to have a public hearing, and that's fine. You can do that. It's just not a requirement at the state level. And again, the intent of that was to give you flexibility. If you've decided that's your policy and that's important to you, then you can do that, but you're not mandated to do it. So hopefully that clarified. The statutory authority relies with the planning commission to kick it up to the council, and the council can decide whether to have a meeting or a hearing, but they're only required to have a meeting. So check your own codes. And think about that flexibility when you do look at hearings and meetings, because the state law has changed significantly, over the last decade to be less formal in the idea of, on some of these things, if you can process them and get them out the door, then do it.
Okay, the next question is who creates the ordinances within special use districts and how is that process carried out?
Okay, so do you mean by special use, do you mean a special district? Or I don't know that I understand what you mean by a special use district. Any zoning district you create, you can call it what you want. You can have the SF, the peace and love zone, the green grass only zone. So I'm not quite sure what us, if you're referring to special districts like a water service district, and that's their own entity and bylaws and council, and they adopt their own rules. So maybe you could put in the chat box clarification on that.
Okay, while we're
And then,
getting that, just one more question is what is your recommended process for updating zoning code in regards to staff, planning commissions, councils, etc.?
yeah, so again, my opinion, there's nothing under the state code that outlines a process, but I have seen quite a few different processes work. I think there's two levels of a code update, and one is just finding out what's out of compliance with state law. So that's kind of your first blush, and that could be perhaps handled if you're lucky enough to have staff. And we have some resources that can help you find out a checklist of things to look for in your code. But I think staff could just do a run through and say, look, we are way out of compliance with state code. These are no-brainer fixes because we're mandated to have or not have these things in our code. The second level would be the policy issue with a layer of how we administer things. In other words, are we being as efficient as possible? And that's the Planning Commission's duty under state law to look at that and make recommendations to the council on who does what. Like, do we need 7 public hearings for this? Do we need 1? Do we need none? When you're administering an item, shouldn't that be as quick as possible? When you're actually doing policy items, maybe that needs to have a lot of thought. And so the Planning Commission, I think, plays a role there. And I think staff can help them navigate that. So again, 2 tiers, state code review, and then the policy who does what process. And I also recommend that you take sections. It can get overwhelming, but if you break it up into pieces and know that you're gonna really have to dedicate some time and resources and extra meetings and go in with that attitude that, yes, this is gonna take an extra lift, but we can do it. And I think that's a starting point, but I'm happy to talk with you further, whoever submitted that question.
And Meg, then just the clarification on the special districts. Yeah, I think that's what sorry, yeah, the special use districts. Is Daybreak, is that an example of a special use district and what goes into that?
Yeah, thank you. That helps me tremendously. So Daybreak was done as another outside of or within the flexibility of the Land Use and Development Act. Cities and towns can enter into development agreements, and a development agreement is basically a contracted negotiation, and that's where you can set the vision or zoning or create differences for that. And so I believe my understanding is that was a rezone for a master plan development that had its own parameters. So yes, it wasn't a traditional zone, and you absolutely have the ability to do that at the council. Again, the same process. Planning Commission hears the one public hearing and then makes a recommendation up to the council. Typically with councils, they'll negotiate the development agreements, but the parameters of maybe any financial agreements or phasing, but usually then they kick it back down to the Planning Commission when it's executed. My understanding is with Daybreak, like each section as that comes in goes through a review at the Planning Commission level. So again, the ultimate authority for those, whatever you want to call them, is with the same process of creating a zoning ordinance. Because again, you can have the ability to create zones, at the uses within those zones, at your discretion within those parameters of state law. Hopefully that helps you.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Meg. And then just one more question. Within a 5-year general plan review, what is the main goal to look at in updating the plan, or maybe some of the most key points that you should be looking at?
In a general plan review?
Yes.
So, and again, it's a subjective decision, but I would look at the date first. I have often folks who haven't touched it for 10 years. And so in that case, you may want to go back and start with the core requirements, which is land use, housing, and transportation, and look at those elements and kind of bring them up to speed, because those are the mandated elements. And then perhaps revisit and look at other elements. Do they still make sense? Are there new ones because our community has grown that we should really consider and add, and maybe make a checklist? So I had one community that went through element by element, and they said, okay, we're going to take 4 months, 6 months. We're going to do element by element. They did outreach on that element. They updated the element, and they adopted the element. So again, you can set your work plan, but my thought is start incrementally, because it can get overwhelming, and please don't let it, and have faith, and you can walk through it and try to just create a work plan that makes sense for your community.
And then do we have time for one more question?
We sure do, whoever's left.
So when it comes to the general plan, would you recommend including maps, photos, other types of media within that general plan?
Yes, so the general plan map and a zoning map. If you have zoning, you have to have a map that shows the zoning. With the general plan, you should have a map that's accompanying that, and it can be, it's the more soft and fuzzy. In other words, it's not parcel by parcel by parcel. It's area more in a sense, but absolutely. And I know some of our communities have utilized universities in their areas to help if they don't have the resources to have universities help produce those maps, willing students, maybe as a project. Otherwise, there are engineering firms that can help you do that if you don't have in-house capabilities. But absolutely, because the visual should follow the text.
All right, and I don't think we have any other questions. If there are, you can submit them in the chat box, but I think that's it.
Excellent. I just want to thank you again on behalf of the League of Cities and Towns for all you do for our communities. We greatly appreciate you. And this will be recorded, and we will have 2 more sessions in June. Please all take care of yourselves, and thank you so much for attending today. And Spencer, many thanks for being my right-hand man. All right, we're going to end this, and take care.